Well, it's a lot better than we usually do.
All right, chums up.
Ready, guys?
Let's do this. Leroy Dragons!
Oh my god, he just ran in.
Hey everybody, and welcome back for episode 17 of LFR, the casual podcast for casual players of World of Warcraft, where we make the lore of Warcraft more accessible than Stormwind at the start of this story. You'll see why. We're your hosts, Sarith
and Dracoris. LFR usually stands for looking for raid, but today it stands for loved and fucking respected. You know, like the Royal House of Menethil at the start of this story. You'll see why. Thanks for joining us for another dive into an aspect of lore in the World of Warcraft. Today is part 1 of what we envisage being probably a 3-part series looking into one of Warcraft lore's most popular and polarising characters, Prince Arthas Menethil, also known as the Lich King. This is a big one, folks. But before we get too into that...
And we wanted to say a special thank you this week, as we will every week, to our AOTC patrons. We have Mud, Sky Shrouder, Gershom, Anna, and Discordian Kitty. Thank you guys so much for the support. It means a lot to us. So this week in the news, we have quite a little bit. We have the Mage Tower is returning with the Legion Time Walking, which will be, I think, a lot of fun. Some people are mad, but I'm looking forward to it because I didn't do it in Legion.
Some people are mad about everything. You know, if you try and make everybody happy, you're going to struggle.
That's true. Blizzard's being sued again. This time by actual employees rather than the state. They're being sued for retaliation and union busting, essentially. Which I'm shocked that they're being sued for union busting when they hired a law firm specializing in union busting.
Yeah, my take when we did the Blizzard lawsuit episode about how, you know, the people at WilmerHale are probably good moral people just doing a job, that's starting to look like a bad take.
Just a little. Not as bad as your Dreadlord takes, but a little. Some in-game stuff has been renamed. The area of Macquarie in Argus, among some other associated NPCs. And some suggestive pictures have been replaced with either a less suggestive picture or a bowl of fruit. And some of the community is not pleased, which, again, pretty freaking stupid to get mad at.
Yeah, I think I've seen a few things on Twitter where, you know, different people having different takes on this. The bottom line is, you know, somebody in the company felt that changing these pictures was a good idea. Now, we're not in any position to say whether the people who've made that decision are, you know, as half of Twitter seem to think, you know, executives trying to cover up a lawsuit by changing some pictures in game. That seems unlikely to me. Or, you know, people working at Blizzard who have actually been affected by all this and have been working alongside harassers and horrible people for years, who are finally getting a chance to take away some of the things in game that remind them of those people. I lean towards that position personally. And on that basis, I think that the art changes are a good idea. Don't know about you.
Yeah, I agree. I think the same. Now, we should probably get to the lore.
And how is education supposed to make me feel smarter? Besides, every time I learn something new, it pushes some old stuff out of my brain.
So, as you all know, every week I ask my partner Lou what she knows about the topic at hand. This week, I asked her what she knew about Arthas Menethil. She said, he's the Lich King, right? He raised a load of undead? Something about a plague. Icecrown Citadel. When I asked her if she knew anything about Arthas before he became the Lich King, she said she knew she probably should, but couldn't think of anything. Now, I'll point out at this stage that I tried to read the Arthas novel to her once, but she fell asleep before we got past chapter 1. She plays the game without the sound, so she's never heard the whole iconic Culling of Stratholme exchange, and I know she never played Warcraft 3. So yeah, I wouldn't have expected her to have picked up much outside of the Wrath stuff, and even that I don't think she ever played it as current content. So this episode and the next few episodes are going to be something entirely new for her, I think. So yeah, who is Arthas Menethil? Let's find out.
Glad you could make it.
So Prince Arthas Menethil was born to King Tyrannus Menethil and Queen Leanne Menethil about 4 years before the Orcs invaded Azeroth, according to Chronicle. That timing fits sort of weirdly around the events of his life, though. It might actually have been more like 8 years before then. It's hard to be sure. We kind of have to fudge the numbers, and I generally go with what Christy Golden says in her novel. Now, Arthas' story has been told in a few different places. Chronicles, Warcraft 3, obviously Wrath of the Lich King. But it's set out most completely in the novel Arthas, Rise of the Lich King by Christy Golden. And so that is the source that I'll be using for most of this stuff.
And outside of that, you'll also be using the source of Christy Golden herself responding to you on Twitter.
This is true. There's a point later on in this that I asked Christy about on Twitter last night, and she was kind enough to respond, which is pretty cool. And we'll talk about that when we get there. So, the first chapter of the novel does an amazing job of setting the scene, really, and showing us what young Arthas' life was like. Spoiler alert, it is in fact a life of privilege. Shock. Horror. It shows him in a stable watching a foal being born, and it explains that he was close friends with the son of the Master of Horse for the castle. Not exactly an appropriate friendship for a prince, but Arthas basically got to do whatever he wanted. He was a fairly coddled kid. Now, this world of basically getting to do whatever the hell he wants and slack off is shattered when he is basically dragged out of the stables by Uther, who at this point was a knight in King Tyrannus' service, not actually a paladin at this stage.
I just now realized that at that point Uther wasn't a paladin.
Nope, because the Paladin Order was formed as a response to the sacking of Stormwind, which happens right about now. So the reason Uther drags him back to the castle on horseback is because the Orcs have arrived and they have sacked Stormwind. They have absolutely wrecked the place. They have killed King Lane Rin, the King of Stormwind and Varian's daddy, and the survivors are on their way to Lordaeron for aid. They are, at this point, refugees. Now, Prince Varian Rin, who was the subject of our episode 5, he arrives at this point in Lordaeron, which is the kingdom that Arthas lived in. King Tyrannus, Arthas' dad, welcomes Varian as a fellow ruler. It's actually really cool. He treats him pretty much as an equal, despite the fact that Varian is A, a child, and B, hasn't actually got a city to rule over at this point because the Orcs are busy sort of stomping on the ashes. And Tyrannus leaves him with Arthas. There's a really cool scene where the two boys discuss what happened and Varian tells Arthas about his father's assassination. At a loss for words, Arthas decides, sort of on a whim, to tell the older boy about the foal he saw being born. And he says, "When the weather lets up, I'll take you to see him. He's the most amazing thing."
He really has a thing for horses.
He does, but it was also the right thing to say in the moment, I think. It kind of distracted Varian. And the book says that Varian turned towards him and gazed at him for a long moment. It says, emotions flitted across his face. Offence, disbelief, and gratitude, yearning, understanding. Then it said that his eyes filled with tears and he looked away, folded his arms and hunched in on himself, his shoulders shaking with sobs he did his best to muffle. It says that he mourns things. He mourns a father, a kingdom, a way of life that he probably hadn't been able to grieve until that precise moment. And Arthur squeezed his arm. At this point, Varian sobs and says, "I hate winter." And Arthas thinks that it's, a non sequitur at this point. And he looks out the window and he watches the snow start to fall. It is a non sequitur, however, looking at what happens with Arthas and where he ends up, look at, where the vast majority of the Wrath of the Lich King expansion is set. snow and winter and cold are themes that are going to be huge for Arthas. And it's interesting to me that that's something Christie chooses to use in that chapter. We don't actually ever get to see an awful lot of interaction between Varian and Lich King Arthas. But the fact that Varian hates winter even then, I think it's quite a neat choice.
Yeah, I did like that.
Now, Chapter 2 then introduces some other elements that are going to be huge for the first part of Arthas' story. We start off with Arthas training with Varian, and there's not really any other way to say this than that he sucks. I mean, he sucks bad. There's good reason, though. The difference between Arthas and Varian at this point is that Varian was taught swordplay and war from a really young age, and Arthas wasn't. It's a different parenting style. Arthas' dad was more protective than Varian's, who kind of wanted him to step up and learn these things. At this point, he's at the age where you would start to teach him this sort of stuff, except because of the war, every able-bodied man in Lordaeron is gone. They've gone off to join the war effort. This means that even down to the Master of Horse and the Master of Arms and the blacksmith, they're all gone. There is no adult there to teach Arthas to sword fight, now that, he probably needs to know these things. And Varian tries a little bit before basically giving up. And he says, I've been trained to fight, but I haven't been trained to teach. And if we keep going on, I'm going to hurt you. Arthas takes that really quite badly. He takes it as an insult, actually, even though it's definitely not meant as one. It's pretty clear here that Varian is trying to be sweet. He's the older boy, and he's trying to make Arthas feel better about himself.
That's one of the quotes I always remember from the book, is Arthas being like, no thought that I might hurt him, just he might hurt me.
Yeah. Absolutely, that's exactly right. And it even says, Arthas sulked. He knew Varian well enough to know that the older prince was trying to soften the blow. And it does give us a little indication of who Arthas is, though. At this point in time, he's just a kid, but he is petulant, and that is a character flaw that continues right the way through his life. Sorry, I just flicked back to the book for a second to see that exact quote, and it is pretty great. But yeah, so he does suck. And then we see a 2-year time skip. And in that, there's a little paragraph explaining what happened in those 2 years. And it talks about the end of the war. Talks about the Horde war chief Orgrim Doomhammer being captured by the humans. And the formation of the internment camps that are there to house the orcs. That's a decision that Turalyon made, by the way. He chose, essentially, not to kill Orgrim or the other orcs. And the rest of the Alliance kind of got stuck with that decision. They end up with these very costly internment camps. We also hear that Orgrim escaped from this prison in Undercity. At this point, the Undercity wasn't what we picture in game now. It was just like a big network of dungeons underneath Lordaeron. And he was recaptured, and he was then placed in an internment camp, which he promptly broke out of as well. So 2 years pass, and
He's harder to hold on to than El Chapo.
Yeah, and at this point they're all kind of holding their breath because Orgrim's gone, and they're all a little bit worried he's going to do something, but they don't know what or when or why, and they're just kind of hoping that the peace will hold. Spoiler alert, it doesn't. But yeah, so these 2 years pass, and Arthas has still had absolutely no martial training at all. No adult has even attempted to show him how to use a sword, even though the war is now over. Arthas is walking through the same sort of area that he and Varian had trained in. And he's now 11 years old, and he picks up this practice sword, looks around to make sure no one's watching, throws out some really crappy trash talk, and takes a practice swing at a suit of armour. Now, he doesn't try to hit the armour because he knows that the armour is expensive and he'll be in trouble if he breaks it. So he deliberately whiffs that, and then fucks up badly and throws the sword across the room. And it lands at the feet of Muradin Bronzebeard. Now, Muradin is the brother to the dwarven king Magni Bronzebeard, the dwarven ambassador to the human nations, and a very good friend of Arthas' father. This moment is incredibly fucking embarrassing for both of them. Like, Christy Golden has a real talent. I mean, she's got a talent for writing generally, but she's got a really good talent for writing embarrassing moments. And she says here, Muradin was the dwarven ambassador to Lordaeron, brother to King Magni Bronzebeard, and a great favourite at court. He had a reputation as an excellent warrior, cunning and fierce in battle. And he had just watched the future King of Lordaeron pretend to fight orcs and throw his sword clear across the room. Arthas felt his entire body break out in a sweat, and he knew his cheeks were pink. Ambassador, I was just... It then says, the dwarf coughed and looked away. You can just feel the cringe in that moment.
I'd say she did a great job of like describing the feeling of cringe.
Yeah, and then he doesn't do himself any favours here either. He says, Arthas has never been more embarrassed in his life. Tears of shame burned in his eyes and he blinked them back hard. Without even bothering to put away the wooden sword, he fled the room. Now, I'll tell you what, I reckon for Muradin, the fact that he didn't even bother picking the sword up would have been just as bad as the first thing he did. You know? Like, clean up your mess, man. So Arthas' response to this is to go for a ride on his horse. Now, we hear about how the foal he had watched being born was now his own horse, and he had named him Invincible. However, you know, this horse is only 2 years old. Arthas wasn't allowed to ride him yet. It'd be at least another year before that was allowed. Instead, he was taking Invincible with him, you know, holding the reins, I think, while he rode an old gelding called Trueheart. But our boy Arthas doesn't do so well with boundaries. He looks at Invincible and he thinks, basically, well, I know I'm not supposed to do this, and I know it could cripple the horse if it goes badly wrong, but fuck it, I'm a prince, I can do what I want, right? It'll be fine. So he rides Invincible. And it ends badly. I don't know whether anyone we're listening to this has any experience riding horses. I know I don't, but I have heard people say that this is a fairly accurate description of what would in fact happen. He tries to get on the horse goes batshit crazy and kicks him off and runs away, and that's Invincible gone, basically. So Arthur sulks back to the castle on Trueheart, the old gelding that he was supposed to be riding. And when he gets to the gates, Uther is waiting for him. Uther is not happy, as you would expect. Uther says that Invincible made it back on his own, and was a little bit of the worse for wear, but otherwise okay. And he gives him a speech, and quite rightly, he gives him a speech that's basically, you were told not to fucking do this. Why are you doing it? And Arthas is very sulky about it all and says, I only did it once. But Uther has this really hypocritical line where he says,
I only called Strathholm once, Dad. God.
No, but Uther says, Arthas, do you not understand? If you put too much pressure on him at this age, he gets cut off there, but literally all Uther ever does in this book is put pressure on Arthas at a young age.
I never picked that up either.
You could finish this sentence as, Uther, do you not understand? If you put too much pressure on him at this age, he's going to fucking snap and massacre his own people.
He will kill you. And then your
He
soul
will kill
will be
you.
split in two,
Yeah.
and we'll have to help you in the Shadowlands.
20 years later, yeah. But yeah, so Uther's hypocrisy aside, we then go to the chapel, because of course that's where Uther sends Arthas. And at that point we hear how Arthas actually feels about the light. Now this is really interesting when you consider that Arthas goes on to be a paladin, and is even at this point where he can't fight, he's being pressured to become a paladin. It says, Arthas wasn't even sure what the prayer session was focusing on today. He felt vaguely bad about that. The light was important to both his father and Uther, and he knew that they badly wanted him to be as devout as they were. But while he couldn't argue with the evidence of his own eyes, the light was most definitely real. He'd seen priests and the new order of the Paladins work true miracles with healing and protection. He'd never felt called to sit and meditate for hours as Uther did, or make frequent references in reverent tones as did his father. It was just there. That doesn't sound very Paladin-y, does it?
Not even a little bit.
Not even a little bit. And as I say, they were, even at this stage, he was being pressured to become a paladin. There is a moment in this sermon that he's hearing where the bishop says, and His Royal Highness Arthas Menethil, May the light's blessing be upon him in every thought, word, and deed, so that he may thrive beneath it and grow to serve it as its paladin. So this is a dude who, at this point, no one has even bothered to teach him how to swing a sword, and they're already saying he's going to be a paladin one day.
Well, when he becomes a paladin, though, he doesn't use a sword. He uses a big hammer. Hammers are easy to use. Makes sense.
Yeah, you know what I mean, though, right? Like, this guy, the whole point of being a paladin is you either need to be a priest who learns to fight, or a fighter who learns to be a priest. Like, there are two opposite examples. Turalian started off as a priest and learnt the martial stuff and became a paladin. Uther was a knight who then learnt the light stuff and became a paladin. Like, Arthas at this point doesn't really care about the light and can't use a sword or a hammer or whatever you want to use. Why are they pushing him down the paladin path? Doesn't make a lot of sense. The one thing Arthas did pay attention to in the sermon, though, was Jaina. He sees this young blonde girl at the front of the church, because of course Jaina's sitting at the front of the church, and Arthas is paying very close attention to her at this stage. He would have been 11 and she would have been 10, I think, at this point. So yeah, and he basically realises that the priest is going around giving benedictions to all the important people individually. So he sits there and he realises, oh, hang on a minute, I'm going to find out who this pretty girl is, because the priest is going to have to mention her name. And of course he does. He mentions that it's Jaina Proudmoore. And Arthur starts to think, this could be fun, you know, she'll be here for a few days, I'm going to get to know her, you know. And there's a paragraph where it says, this, Arthur's decided, was a girl who would not mind getting a snowball in the face or going for a swim on a hot day. Someone, unlike his sister, he could play with. Now, that's all very innocent and very nice, really. But already this is Arthur's kind of seeing in people what he wants to see in them, you know? Mm-hmm. Like he doesn't know anything about Jaina at this point. He has literally just seen what her face looks like, and that's it. And he's decided from looking at her that this is someone he's gonna go and, you know, play rambunctious games with. He has decided who he wants Jaina to be before he's ever even spoken to her. And I'm afraid that's kind of on brand for Arthas.
I also get the feeling, though, from that little segment that Arthas is pretty lonely as a kid. Like, he literally just wants somebody to hang out with.
I mean, it seems like he has friends. He is friends with the horse, the Master of Horses kid. That seems to be his closest friend. And he does spend an awful lot of time with adults, yeah, with the guards and stuff. So I think it's true. He probably was lonely and isolated. Yeah, that's probably a fair point. But then maybe the reason he's lonely and isolated is because the other kids think he's a dick.
That's very possible.
Now, the last thing in this chapter is that on the way out of the church, Arthas is intercepted by Muradin, who basically offers to train him out of pity, as far as I can tell. He stops him and says, I'll get right to the point, your fighting form is terrible. And Arthur starts to blame his dad. He says, I know, but father... And he gets cut off mid-sentence, and Muradin says, your father has other things on his mind, don't be saying a thing against him. I mean, this is all written in a horrible Scottish dialect that I'm not even going to try and do, but that's basically the point. He cuts him off, and he says, that's it. And Arthur says, well, I can't very well teach myself how to fight. You saw what happened when I tried. And Muradin says, I get that. I'll teach you. But he does say, I'll take no excuses and I'll push you hard. And if I say that you're wasting my time, I'll stop. And he agrees. And so he signs up for this martial training. But on the way out of the church, he's still looking at Jaina.
The best line in that Muradin telling Arthas he'll train him is Arthas wondering if Muradin will teach him to hold his ale like the dwarves do. Yeah, you're absolutely right. But he decided not to ask that, which does show that at least he has some idea of when it's appropriate to say things and when it's not. 'Cause I think Muradin would have kicked his arse up between his ears for that one. So yeah, and then from there we move on to chapter 3. Now, chapter 3 covers Arthas accompanying Jaina on her way to Dalaran. Now, this is an interesting one because he finds out in that church sermon in chapter 2 that that's what Jaina is there for. She's on her way to Dalaran to become a mage.
Arthas, at this point, offers to be her escort on the trip to Dalaran. Now, let's be completely honest. Arthas as an escort at this point is fucking useless, right? Like, he can't fight. He's literally a child. It's just it's a nobility thing. It's a status thing. But his dad and Uther are very impressed. They think he's, being responsible and signing up for an additional duty. The way he looks at it is that he's getting out of his duties, and it's very, very clear about that. Yeah, this is all written from his perspective, and yeah, it literally says he didn't bother to tell them that it was because he wanted to get out of his duties. It pleased Tyrannus to think of his son as being so responsible. So it's great. It says Jaina smiled brightly at the prospect, and it got Arthas exactly what he wanted. Everyone was happy. Again, it's just Arthas is very manipulative when he wants to be, and he wants to be a lot. So yeah, they go on this trip, and Arthas decides that instead of them finding a place to stay in town, because one of the soldiers wants them to stay at a town called Ambermill, where they can stay in an inn, Arthas says, "No, we'll continue. We can camp overnight in Hillsbrad. It'll get to Jaina quicker. It'll get Jaina to Dalaran quicker." And so that's what they do. They camp, because obviously who are these soldiers to tell Prince Arthas what to do, right? Now, in the middle of the night, we find out that Arthas has an ulterior motive. He wakes Jaina up. No way. Yeah. So at this point, Arthas is 12 and Jaina's 11. He wakes Jaina up to go and try and catch a glimpse of an orc at the nearby internment camp. And they do. Jaina goes along with it. But again, she doesn't go along with it immediately, or particularly willingly. And this is an ongoing theme, right? So he says to Jaina, "There's our destination and points." And she says, "The internment camp." And he says, "Have you ever seen one up close?" And her response is, "No, and I don't want to." He then basically manipulates the fuck out of her into agreeing. And then she agrees.
All
so
while treating
they go
the orcs like they're animals in a cage at a zoo.
Yeah, the entire time. And actually, when they talk about it, yeah, Jaina says, "Oh, they look so sad." And he goes on a rant about how they killed people and how, they wanted to make humans extinct and rah, rah, rah. They killed your brother, Again, he's manipulating her. Like, who's the one who should be cross about them killing Jaina's brother? It's not Arthas, right? It's Jaina. And even after that, she says, "Somehow I didn't think they'd have children. Can you see the one with the baby?" And his response is, "Well, of course they have children. Even rats have children." And then his internal monologue, he was irritated, but then maybe he should have expected a reaction like that from an 11-year-old girl. This is the 11-year-old girl that he was desperate to drag along to this thing to show her the orcs. This is the 11-year-old girl that he had decided just from looking at her would be okay with doing whatever he wanted. And this is his response the second he isn't getting the reaction he wants.
And just that exchange really solidifies a difference between Arthas and Jaina, where Jaina sees the orcs and the conditions they're being forced to live in and feels compassion and pity, and Arthas thinks it's not bad enough.
Yeah, she empathizes with them, I mean, she's going to get thoroughly broken of that over the next 10 to 15 years, unfortunately. But at this point, yeah, she does. She empathizes with the orcs. Yeah, it's fair. And everyone knows I'm not Jaina's biggest defender. But at this point, it's very clear that she has the correct kind of moral compass here. And Arthas is basically just a douchey, entitled teenager. So yeah, they go back. And the thing with this is that the reason that I'm constantly harping on these negative personality traits of Arthas is because you kind of do need to point it out. Like, when we get into the second part of this, there are going to be moments where Arthas makes some really questionable moral decisions. And a lot of people say that he was under external influences when he made those decisions. I say that actually, going to show pretty well over the course of this part one, Arthas was always kind of a douche.
Yep.
Oh. Another thing we see in this chapter is we see a 14-year-old Arthas finally win a sparring match against Muradin. And at this point, Arthas is becoming a badass. The fight itself is interesting because we find out that Muradin is teaching Arthas to fight in the manner of like a barroom brawl kind of fighter. It says he taught him a very effective trick involving a broken wine bottle, for example. The move with which he actually beats Muradin involves lying on his back and shoving his feet in Muradin's midsection, something that Arthas thinks Uther would never do. I think he's underestimating Uther. I think Uther would probably do whatever he needed to win a fight. But you can see the point that he's making. It's not a very paladin-y fighting style that Muradin's teaching Arthas at all. But it does say that at this point, as a 14-year-old, he is big, he is strong, he is fast, and he is getting to be very good at fighting. So you can kind of see how in a few years, when he is fully grown, he's going to be an absolute beast. Unfortunately, we also see that he's still kind of a self-centered shitbag. He overhears a conversation between his family, and he learns that his sister Kalia is being married off to a noble named Davil Prestor. Now, I don't think it comes up in this book, but Prestor is Deathwing in human form. So this is a really bad move from King Tyrannus. Really bad move. And actually, he's betrothing his daughter to this noble, who is older than her, even though she's not legally old enough to be married yet, and even though she clearly does not want to. So Arthas goes to have a conversation with Kalia about all this, and at first he seems fairly empathetic. It seems like he wants to help her and understand what's going on. But then he quite quickly changes gear. He goes from saying, Kalia, I'm really sorry, is there anyone else? Maybe you could convince Father there's a better match, one that makes you happy as well. And then Kalia says, it's no use, you heard, he didn't ask, he didn't suggest, he ordered. Arthas, when you are king, promise me that you won't do that to your children. And of course at this point, Arthas starts thinking about himself. And that's pretty much it. The next couple of paragraphs are him thinking about himself. And then he says, I'm sorry, Callie, but maybe you're the lucky one. It might be worse to have the freedom to choose and know that you couldn't have what you wanted. She says I would trade that for being a piece of meat in a heartbeat. And he says, we each have our duties, I guess. You to marry whoever Father wants and me to marry well for the kingdom. I'm sorry, Callie. And he gets up and leaves. And that's it. Really empathetic brother, right?
Yeah, that was super douchey. She's literally saying, like, I'm miserable, I don't want to do this. And he's like, yeah, you have it easier than I do. I actually have to pick who I'm going to marry. Ugh.
Yeah, in like 3 years' time, 4 years' time. You know, the fact that you're going to be getting forcibly betrothed to some creepy old dude in the next week, that's fine, that's easy. So what he then does is he goes for a ride. Now, at this point, his horse is old enough and he is allowed to ride Invincible. And that's what he does. So instead of dealing with his emotions, instead of helping Kalia, who actually needed him at this point, he goes for a horse ride. And what he does is, it says, so he's on the horse, and it says, they were coming up on the jump Arthas loved now. To the east of Capital City, which is what we now know as Lordaeron, by the way, and close to the Bolnir farmstead, was a small cluster of hills. Invincible surged, the earth devoured by his pounding hooves, pulling himself upward toward the precipice, almost as fast as if they were on level ground. He wheeled and turned along the narrow pathways, sending stones scattering with his hooves, his heart and Arthas's both racing in excitement. Then Arthas guided the stallion to the left, over an embankment, a shortcut to the Balnir property. Invincible did not hesitate, had not hesitated even the first time Arthas had asked him to leap. He gathered himself and launched forward, and for a glorious, heart-stopping moment, horse and rider were airborne. Then they landed securely on soft, springy grass and were off again. Invincible.
Maybe
no,
that's
I'm sorry.
why Arthas loves Invincible, because it just blindly does whatever he tells it to.
Exactly. And there are a few things to take from this, right? One is that despite having already had an accident involving this horse, and having been told very clearly that if you don't treat these things with respect, you could hurt them, he's still doing stupid shit, right? Like, unless you're playing Skyrim, you should not be jumping off a mountain on a fucking horse. It is stupid, right? No one does that. It's not a thing that people do, right? So bad, irresponsible, bad pet owner, bad horse owner, bad person, right? But also, like, as you say, the reason he goes from dealing with his family members who aren't willing to say and do what he says and who don't put him first immediately and instinctually, to his horse, who will absolutely put its own safety at the background and do what it's told. It's bad, you know. The thing with it is as well is that control is a massive thing with Arthas. You could see it with Jaina, and you can see it again here, and it is just sad to me. So from there we move on to chapter 4. Chapter 4 details Arthas' state visit to Durnhold, which is one of the internment camps and one that we heard about in episode 2, Thrall. Arthas clearly disapproves of Blackmore, the scumbag overlord there who we discuss in episode 2, but he does approve very much of watching Thrall fight in gladiatorial combat. Now, one night during his 5-day visit there, Taretha Foxton knocks on his door. You might remember her from episode 2 as well. She was essentially like Thrall's foster sister, and she's the one who was, you know, basically being forced into servitude by Blackmore, and by that I mean she's essentially being raped regularly. It's not good. It's in fact absolutely terrible. Taretha had a very, very sad life. I think we're about 6 months at this point away from the point where Blackmore will actually kill Taretha Foxton. And it's very, very sad. Now, what he does here is he sends Taretha to Arthas as an offering, essentially. Arthas turns her down, and in fact it takes him a while to even realise what she's suggesting. But when he does realise, he turns her down, and when she says she'll be in trouble if she returns too soon, he sits and talks with her for hours before sending her back, you know, unmolested, I guess. The implication here is that Arthas is some sort of great guy for not taking advantage of her. I mean, it's a very low bar.
Yeah.
You know, don't get me wrong, he does do the right thing here to a degree, but actually the right thing to do at this point would have been to get Blackmore removed from his post and, you know, maybe kick the shit out of him for good measure.
Say, Arthas is probably a better fighter than Blackmore at that point. It would be a simple thing for him to go down to his room, where he's probably drunk, and beat the fuck out of him.
Or, you know, use the contingent of guards that you've got with you and put the wanker under arrest, right? There are so many things that you could do here. There are so many things you could do here that are better than just sending her back to him.
Yep.
And it's bad. And honestly, I believe that it does mean that on some level, Arthas is responsible for her eventual death. You know, if you are a police officer who ignores a domestic violence call or doesn't do anything about it and the victim ends up dead, you bear a measure of responsibility. And I believe that Arthas bears a measure of responsibility for what happens with Tari here, personally.
Yeah.
And, you know, and there are parallels. There are parallels to things that are going on even at Blizzard. You know? Being a guy who worked at Blizzard and knew that somebody else was a horrendous sexual harasser and not doing anything about it either way doesn't make you a good person.
Mm-hmm.
You know? It just means you're not as bad as the person doing the bad thing. So yeah, and this chapter does end in tragedy. When he goes back to Lordaeron, it's a snowy day, and Arthas takes Invincible out anyway and decides to go and do the usual jump off the hill that we saw in the last chapter. The horse lands badly, breaks his legs. Arthas is not yet a paladin and can't heal him. He watches the horse thrash and writhe for a long time before eventually putting him out of his misery. Arthas then does 3 things. First, he asks for Invincible to be buried in a specific place so he can visit, and that's going to be important later in the next episode or the one after that. Second, he lies and says that it was an accident and Invincible slipped. You know, blaming somebody else for his problems. And third, he vows that if anyone else ever needed protection, that if sacrifices had to be made for the welfare of others, he would do it, whatever it takes. I'll be honest, I've never quite seen what that has to do with a dead horse. I don't know if there's a stretch here where he's saying he'll sacrifice wanting to jump off hills if it would have kept Invincible alive. I think it's a really weird thought to have had at that point in time. He also doesn't really follow up on it, because the first thing he didn't do, he didn't go back to Durnhold and free Taretha, for example, and kill Blackmore.
Yeah.
There are people who he has seen need protection, and he has done nothing about it at this point. I understand what Christy Golden was doing when she wrote this. She was setting the seed for him being willing to make hard decisions later in his life. The culling of Stratholme, I think, is probably the main one. And I think this is her way of kind of giving him some sort of motive for being able to make that decision. But I do think it's a little bit ham-fisted.
Yeah, it did feel like a very on-the-nose comparison, like Arthas and Darth Vader, where Darth Vader's moment like that was when his mom died, and Arthas is when he made his horse jump off a cliff
he killed
in
a horse,
fucking blizzard and killed it.
Yeah, it's they are different things, but maybe it's a measure of how arrogant Arthas is, that's the way he sees it. I don't know.
It's
but
not
I
my
think
fault.
that,
it's the weather's fault. The weather should have been better.
Yeah.
It knew I wanted to ride today.
But for someone who generally is very good at writing these kind of things, I think it's a bit of a slip up from Christie, if I'm honest. So we then go to chapter 5. Oh, hang on, one other thing as well. Invincible. I don't know whether you knew this, Sarith, but Invincible is a character. I don't know if character is the right word when you're talking about a horse, but Invincible is something that Christy Golden designed. Like, before this book existed, Invincible didn't exist. Arthas's horse wasn't named previously. And, the mount that drops from ICC wouldn't exist if it wasn't for Christy Golden writing this stuff in this book about Invincible.
So I get to go yell at Christy Golden about the fact that fucking thing still won't drop, because I'm pretty sure it doesn't exist.
You absolutely wouldn't be the first person to do that.
Please don't
do that. Yeah,
about Invincible
don't do
not
that, guys.
dropping. It's not her fault.
No, it's not. But yeah, so Invincible genuinely wouldn't exist if it weren't for Christie, which I think is pretty cool. So chapter 5 deals with 19-year-old Arthas and his induction to the ranks of the Silver Hand, which is the Paladin order. In this chapter, it tells us a few things. So the night before the ceremony, Arthas visited Varian, because this all happens in Stormwind at the Cathedral of Light. So obviously he's moved on to the newly rebuilt Stormwind, which is where, Varian is now ruling. So Arthas visits Varian, and the two of them get absolutely blind drunk and have a sword fight with training swords, which I think is absolutely hilarious. And if they ever decided to put that in game or give us a cinematic of it or something, I would love to see it. Honestly, because like the sort of the friendship and the relationship that Arthas and Varian have is something that basically doesn't exist anywhere other than the few chapters in this book. And it's a shame, because it would have been pretty cool to see. Arthas also met Baby Anduin on this trip, which is a nice little note. Now, Arthas was not at all sure he was ready to become a paladin. We've already sort of talked about why. He doesn't really feel much about the light, and he's never felt called to it. Well, yeah, that too. I mean, I'm sure he doesn't say that, because I'm sure he doesn't think that. But yeah. But he told Uther, he said, "I'm not sure I'm ready for this." And instead of listening, and potentially saving a lot of people a lot of heartache, Uther said this: "Lad, no one feels ready. No one feels he deserves it. And you know why? Because no one does. It's grace, pure and simple. We are inherently unworthy, simply because we're human. And all human beings, I and elves and dwarves and all the other races, are flawed."
Who we don't let be paladins.
But the light loves us anyway. Hey, all of those races can be paladins.
Yeah, but not then.
Okay. But he says, but the light loves us anyway. It loves us for what we sometimes can rise to in rare moments. It loves us for what we can do to help others. And it loves us because we can help it share its message by striving daily to be worthy, even though we understand that we can't ever truly become so. So stand there today, as I did, feeling that you can't possibly deserve it or ever be worthy, and know that you're in the same place every single paladin has ever stood. Now, I think a few things about that speech. One is Uther is literally projecting at this point.
Yeah.
Like he's saying, that's how I felt, therefore it's true, and therefore it's how you feel. Right? Like, Arthas isn't saying I'm unworthy of the light. Arthas is saying I don't think I should be a paladin. They're two very different things, right? Mm-hmm. And the other thing is, when you read this paragraph, right, these paragraphs, you could replace light with God, and you will essentially just get like a Christian sermon, right? That's what this is. And again, I don't blame Christy Golden for this. You know, at this point in time when this book was written, I have absolutely no doubt that nobody at Blizzard realised that we were moving towards, you know, cosmic disco war.
Yeah. No, the light was basically quote unquote God then.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the problem, right? Like, there are so many things. I had a chat with Jin, formerly of Morally Grey and now of Live Laugh Law. I had a chat with him about this yesterday because I was trying to wrap my head around some of this stuff involving the light. Because there are a lot of times where the light does seem to behave as if it's like a sentient thing. You know, we see Tyrion Fordring get stripped of his connection to the light at one point in a short story. He then regrows it in the same story later on. Mm-hmm. You know, there's a moment here in a second where Arthas has a thing with the light that we'll talk about. But, like, it doesn't really fit with lore as it is now in relation to what the light actually is and what we're actually doing with it. And, you know, it makes me wonder. It makes me wonder who empowered the Silver Hand in the first place. Have they found some way of tapping into the light by themselves? Is there actually a Naru watching over the paladins on Azeroth?
That's what I was just wondering. Is there like a go-between for the mortals who wield the light that decides whether or not they can?
Exactly, and I don't know.
Like, like you said, a Naru or a greater force that's just like, that guy can, but fuck that guy.
And Jin's theory on this, which I think is quite a good one, is that it's like it's all in your head. You know, it's a psychosomatic thing. So when they told Tyrion they were stripping him of his power, he believed they had the power to do that, so they had the power to do that, you know? And it's interesting, and it's worth bearing that in mind for the next bit. So, at this sort of, what's the word? Induction, I think, is the word they use, right? Rather than, like, coronation or whatever. 4 of the 5 original paladins were present for this. Uther, Tyrion Fordring, Saidan Dathrahan, and Gavin Rad the Dyer. Terralion was away on Outland at this point. So Arthas was presented with... I mean, ironically, he probably could, but at this point they all thought he was dead, right?
Yeah, he was kind of busy fighting a war with the Army of Light.
Yeah, absolutely, becoming a zealot. You know, he was away. He was away at Bible camp essentially. So Arthas was presented with a holy warhammer called Light's Vengeance at this point. Now, I will say, Light's Vengeance is just the name of the in-game item when we eventually get our hands on it. At no point in the story does Arthas' hammer actually get called Light's Vengeance. It's just his warhammer. But yeah, Gavin Rad gives him this big hammer, and he has some ceremonial silver plates, like pauldrons, placed on his shoulders by Uther. And then during this ceremony, something really interesting happens. So the quote from the book is, "The clerics and paladins all lifted right hands, which were now suffused by a soft golden glow. They pointed at Arthas, directing the radiance toward him. Arthas's eyes were wide with wonder, and he waited for the glorious glow to envelop him. Nothing happened. The moment stretched on. Sweat broke out on Arthas's brow. What was going wrong? Why wasn't the light wrapping itself around him in blessing and benediction? And then the sunlight streaming in through windows in the ceiling slowly began to move towards the prince standing alone in shining armour, and Arthas exhaled in relief. This had to be what Uther had spoken of. The feeling of unworthiness that Uther assured him all paladins felt simply seemed to drag out the moment. The words Uther had spoken came back to him. No one feels he deserves it. It's grace, pure and simple, but the light loves us anyway. Kind of a cool moment, but the light loves us anyway. Does it? Does it really? Like, maybe the light wasn't so sure about Arthas after all. As Sarith alluded to earlier, I asked Christy Golden about this last night on Twitter, and she, did me the honour of actually responding, which was very kind of her. And what she said was, I left that up to the reader to decide. So the question I asked was, did the light actually withhold its approval from Arthas? Or is it just, the feeling of unworthiness that Uther mentioned? And Christie says that's up to the reader to decide.
Which
So it's an interesting one.
I personally lean on the side of the light finding Arthas unworthy. Not that the light is omnipotent. Like it doesn't foresee the Lich King and Arthas, everything he does, but everything he's done up to that moment is not paladin-like.
Yeah, and I think there's kind of a middle ground between the two. And this is basically the theory that Jin gave me last night, but I think he might be right about this, which is that it's not so much that the light withheld its approval, and it's not so much that everybody feels doubt and so it seems like it takes longer. I think it's probably that Arthas himself wasn't sure if he was worthy, and because of that it took a while for him to take on board the power, Like, if Arthas himself had doubts, maybe that is literally why it took so long. Not that it felt like it took so long because he was doubting himself, but that it actually did take so long because he was doubting himself,
Yeah.
And actually his kind of innate arrogance in the end wins out over that doubt.
Of course I'd be worthy.
Yeah, well, it's that moment where he says, why wasn't the light wrapping itself around me in blessing and benediction? Not why am I not good enough? Why isn't the light doing what it's told? That's Arthas's attitude. And, it's right there in black and white in the book. So this chapter then ends with Arthas celebrating with his friends and family. Jaina hugs him, and he considers kissing her, but he overthinks it and misses his chance, and then he's swept into his family, and there's this rather petulant exchange with his dad. So Tyrannus, he gets swept in front of, and it says, "Well done, my son," Tyrannus said. "I am a proud father today." Arthas's eyes narrowed. Today? What was meant by that? Was his father not proud of him on other days? He was suddenly angry, and not certain why, or with whom. The light delaying its approval, Jaina backing away from him right at the moment when he could have kissed her, Tyrannus in his comment. He forced a smile, and began to shoulder his way through the crowd. He'd had enough of this press of people, few of whom really knew him, none of whom understood. Arthas was 19. At the same age, Varian had been king for a full year. He was of an age to do whatever he wanted to, and he now had the blessing of the Silver Hand to guide him. He didn't want to simply linger at the Palace of Lordaeron or do boring state visits. He wanted to do something fun, something that his power, his position, his abilities would earn him, and he knew exactly what he wanted that something to be. Motherfucker, right?
Just listening to that bit, when you hit the Arthas was 19 stage, I was like, it's like a fucking rebellious teenager going through an emo phase. It's not a
rebellious
phase,
teenager.
Mom.
Yeah,
It's
but a
not
rebellious
phase,
teenager
Uther.
with money and power and privilege, right?
Well, yeah, they do shitty things.
This is a rebellious teenager who has the power to do shit. And the fact that, so I would be willing to bet you anything that when Turalyon was inducted into the Silver Hand, his first thought was,
let's go fuck up some
what
orcs.
can I do? No, I don't even think it would have been at that point, because remember, he was having his whole crisis of faith about whether he could kill orcs.
Oh, yeah.
No, I think Turalyon's first thought was, how can I help people?
Yeah.
Yeah? We see at the start of Beyond the Dark Portal, I think, or Tides of Darkness, one of the two, we see at the start of one of those books that Turalyon, despite being a full paladin, is walking around in a brown robe feeding the poor. Right? Because that's what he wanted to do with the power he'd been given. What Arthas wants to do with the power he's been given is go and fucking party. I will fucking die on this hill. Arthas should never have been a paladin. He hasn't got the right attributes for it, and I think he proves this with the first thing he does upon being inducted. His first thought is, I now have power and privilege and prestige, and I'm going to use it to go and do what I want.
Yeah.
He wanted to do something fun.
If Arthas was a real life person, he would be Donald Trump Jr.
Yeah. It's this line, it's these two lines here. He wanted to do something fun, something that his power, his position, his abilities would earn him. And the thing that he wants to do, I mean, we're going to talk next episode about what he wants to do, so I think it's quite a nice place to leave it on sort of a cliffhanger for people. But you know, anybody who hasn't read this book and doesn't go and read it between now and then, I'd be really interested to hear what people think the next thing Arthas does with his power is, right? The first thing he chooses to do upon becoming a paladin, what does he choose to do? It'd be really interested to see what people think. But honestly, yeah, and this is pretty much where we're going to leave Arthas' story until next week. And the plan is that essentially this part 1 is going to be Arthas pre-paladin. Part 2 is going to be Arthas as a paladin. And part 3 is going to be Arthas after he is no longer a paladin. And that's kind of how we're going to split it, I think.
Oh, I'm so excited for these.
Yeah. So what do you think, Bud? You got any more thoughts on Arthas from the stuff we've just discussed?
Not too much. It opened my eyes a little bit to how shitty he kind of was even before everything. Like, little bits had stood out to me before when I would read the book, like the little speech after the paladin ceremony, but he was kind of consistently shitty.
Yeah, and the thing is, when you read this book, right, when you read this book for the first time, you don't necessarily notice all of this stuff. Like, I'm not an English lit. I mean, well, actually, I did do English lit to a high level at school, but I'm not like an English teacher or something. But like, when you go through and really analyze this stuff, and when you're looking for it, you find it, you know. And I think the thing is that it is there. I'm not inferring much here, you know. I'm reading what is on the text, and I don't think that someone who is as good a writer as Christie Golden put this stuff in by accident. You know, he is not, even before he goes down a dark road, he's a very different Golden Prince to Anduin. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Yeah, Anduin is selfless and helps people. And the book will talk about, like, Arthas bringing a cup of tea to a guard, but there's a big difference. And
also, we know why Arthas does that. Arthas brings a cup of tea to a guard to get out of what he's supposed to be doing at that moment in time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah? Like, Arthas wants to be one of the boys, but he doesn't want to put the work in to get there. And that's the thing with Arthas. You know, he is loved by his people. That is a fact. Like, for some reason, they all love him. But then you see that even now. Like, look at the royal family in England at the moment. I'm not saying that any of them are horrible people. I'm not saying that any of them are good people. I'm not really getting into that. What I will say is that there is a massive, rabid community of people who adore the royal family.
Shit.
For one reason or another.
Trump has a cult. Like,
yeah, but I'm talking specifically about...
a lot of people love you. That doesn't mean you're a good person.
True, but I mean, those people actually like him because he's a piece of shit, because they are also pieces of shit.
Yeah.
That's different. What I'm talking about is the monarchy in Britain, right, which is about as close as you're going to get in modern day to Lordaeron, right, in terms of the fact that we have an actual monarchy. When you look at when they have a kid, right, so Prince, what's his name, is it George? I'm not particularly a monarchist, but there is a young lad at the moment who's like, you know, Prince William's son or whatever, and I want to say it's George. There is a massive community of people who love him, and whenever a picture of him appears on the internet, they go insane, right? And that is essentially why people like Arthas. You know, he's a prince. He's a prince who would go around and talk to people and be around people. And because of that, they think he's amazing. Doesn't necessarily mean he's amazing, you know? It's status. And what I say is that if you put Anduin in Arthas' position, right? If you put Anduin in a position where Taretha comes and knocks on his door like that, I absolutely fucking guarantee you that Blackmore is hanging the next day.
Yeah. Definitely.
You know, and that's why when people make the comparisons between Anduin and Arthas, I always laugh a little bit, because sure, they look alike. And yeah, now that Anduin is under the power of the jailer, there are further parallels that people can reach. But they are not the same kind of person at all. And I'm pretty confident that when Anduin comes out of things on the other end, we'll see that.
Yeah. Anduin's going to have a lot of PTSD.
Yeah. Bless him. Hopefully it'll make for a good story, though. So next episode we will discuss Anduin's career as a paladin.
Arthas' career as a paladin.
Sorry, Arthas is because Anduin's not a paladin. You see, we did in fact confirm that in episode 1. Yeah, even though in the Escape from the Moor scenario, the other version of him that someone else has next to them is called Stormwind Paladin. But I'm assuming that's just a game mechanic thing. But yeah, so Arthas, we will discuss Arthas' career as a paladin in the next episode, and things are going to get freaky, y'all.
I'll hunt you to the ends of the earth if I have to. Do you hear me? To the ends of the earth!
All right, well, if you guys want to know where you can find us, you can find me on Twitter at Sarith. You can find Dracoris on Twitter at Smiting Titan. You can find the show on Twitter at LFRWowcast. You can email us at lfrwowpod@gmail.com. And if you want to be one of our amazing patrons, you can find us on Patreon at patreon.com/LFRWowcast. Thanks for listening, guys. I am very much looking forward to the next episode, and I hope you are too.
Yeah, we hope you'll all join us for the next episode and not, jump off a hill on a horse in the meantime.
All right, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye.
I am very uncomfortable with the energy that we've created in the studio today.